The sound of ripping denim echoed through the hallway of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta like a gunshot. It was not just a jacket, it was a declaration of war. Sergeant Vance Harlan, a man they called the Hammer, stood towering over a quiet black woman holding the shredded sleeve of her coat in his fist, sneering like he owned the building. He thought she was just another obstacle. He thought she was nobody. He did not know that the woman trembling before him was not a victim. She was the trap. And when the bailiff called everyone to rise, Vance Harlan was going to realize that he had just assaulted the one person on earth with the power to end his life. This is the story of how arrogance met absolute justice. The air conditioning in the federal courthouse was broken again, leaving the hallway smelling of stale floor wax, nervous sweat, and cheap cologne. It was the kind of heat that made tempers short and patience thin. Moving through the crowd like a shark in a wading pool was Sergeant Vance Harlan, 6'4" with a buzz cut that showed off the scar running above his right ear. Vance did not walk. He patrolled. Even here, off-duty in civilian clothes, he wore his arrogance like a badge. He was wearing a tight polo shirt that strained against his biceps, the kind of guy who took up 2 lanes of traffic just because he could. "I am telling you, Danny, it is a wash," Vance said, speaking loudly into his phone, not caring who heard him. He laughed, a barking sound that made a passing paralegal flinch. Internal Affairs has nothing. The dash cam footage was corrupted. You know how it goes. Technical difficulties. He winked at a security guard who looked away, uncomfortable. Vance Harlan had a reputation in the local precinct. They called him the Hammer because when Vance showed up, things got broken. Suspects fell downstairs. Evidence disappeared. Cameras malfunctioned. And for years he had skated by on intimidation and the blue wall of silence. Today was supposed to be his victory lap. A federal inquiry into his unit's conduct regarding the disappearance of narcotics money was scheduled for a preliminary hearing, but Vance knew the judge, Judge Harold Kane. They played poker together. Kane was an old-school hardliner who thought police brutality was just proactive policing. Vance checked his Rolex, a watch that cost 3 times his monthly salary. He was cutting it close, but kings do not rush. He turned the corner toward the courtroom, swinging wide, expecting the sea of people to part for him. Most did, but one person did not. A woman was standing near the water fountain, reviewing a stack of files balanced precariously in her arms. She was black, petite, middle-aged, wearing a nondescript, slightly oversized denim jacket over a gray blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore thick-rimmed reading glasses that slid down her nose. She looked tired. She looked ordinary. Vance, distracted by his own reflection in a window, clipped her shoulder hard. It was not a brush. It was a collision. The files in her arms went flying, scattering across the marble floor like white confetti. Vance stumbled a step, his ego bruised more than his body. He looked down, expecting an apology. The woman did not apologize. She knelt immediately, scrambling to pick up the papers. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low, firm, but not aggressive. "You could watch where you're going, officer." That was the trigger. The word officer. She knew who he was, and she had not called him sir. Vance kicked one of the files away with the toe of his boot. "Maybe you should get out of the way, lady. You are blocking federal property." The hallway went quiet. The ambient noise of the courthouse, the murmuring lawyers, the shuffling feet, died down. People sensed violence. The woman stopped gathering papers. She looked up. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. "I am standing in a public hallway. Pick up that file." Vance laughed. It was a cruel, incredulous sound. He stepped closer, invading her space, looming over her kneeling form. "I do not pick up trash, and I do not take orders from welfare queens waiting for their public defender. Move." She stood up. She was a foot shorter than him, but she did not step back. "I suggest you step away from me, Mr. Harlan. You are already in a precarious position today." Vance's face turned red. "You know my name. Good. Then you know what I do." He reached out, grabbing the collar of her denim jacket to shove her aside. It was a bullying move, one he had used 1,000 times on street corners. But the jacket was old, or maybe Vance did not know his own strength. The sound was sickeningly loud. The entire left sleeve of her jacket tore away from the shoulder seam, hanging by a few threads. The force of his shove sent her stumbling back against the wall, her head cracking lightly against the plaster. The hallway gasped. A young lawyer dropped his briefcase. Vance stood there, the piece of denim fabric still in his hand, looking at the exposed shoulder of her gray blouse. For a second, he looked surprised. Then he doubled down. "Look what you made me do!" Vance sneered, tossing the fabric onto the floor. "Cheap junk. Next time, buy a suit that fits. Now, get out of my face before I arrest you for assaulting an officer." The woman adjusted her glasses. She did not scream. She did not cry. She reached up, touched the torn shoulder of her jacket, and then looked Vance Harlan dead in the eyes. "You have made a grave error in judgment, Sergeant," she said. Her voice had changed. It was not the voice of a tired woman in a hallway anymore. It was cold steel. "Sue me," Vance spat, stepping over her scattered files. "See how far you get." He stormed off toward the double doors of the courtroom, high-fiving his partner, Officer Tate, who was waiting by the entrance. "What was that about?" Tate asked, looking back at the woman who was calmly gathering her papers. "Nothing," Vance said, adjusting his tie, "just taking out the trash." The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and high stakes. This was a high-profile suppression hearing. The allegations were that Vance's unit, the Street Crimes Task Force, had been systematically shaking down drug dealers, stealing the cash, and planting evidence to cover their tracks. But Vance was not worried. He sat at the defense table next to his lawyer, attorney Philip Lang. Lang was a slippery man in an expensive suit known for getting cops off the hook. "Where is Judge Kane?" Vance whispered, leaning over. "He is usually on the bench by now." Lang shuffled some papers, looking slightly annoyed. There had been a last-minute substitution. "Kane had a family emergency." Vance frowned. "Substitution? Who did we get?" "Unclear," Lang said. "But do not worry. The prosecution's case relies on the testimony of a junkie and a missing ledger. We are golden." Vance leaned back, stretching his arms over the back of the bench. He scanned the gallery. He saw the weeping mother of the kid he had framed last year. He saw the internal affairs rat, Detective Lewis, sitting in the back row. Vance locked eyes with Lewis and smirked. "You cannot touch me," the smirk said. He felt invincible. He was the predator in the tank. He replayed the moment in the hallway in his mind, the satisfying sound of the jacket tearing. It felt good to assert dominance right before the trial. It got his blood pumping. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. The rustling of clothes filled the air as everyone stood up. The side door behind the bench opened. Vance buttoned his suit jacket, puffing out his chest. He prepared to give the judge his best humble public servant nod. But the figure that emerged from the chambers was not the elderly stooped figure of Judge Kane. It was a woman. She moved with terrifying grace. Her black judicial robes flowed around her like storm clouds. She did not look at the gallery. She walked straight to the high-backed leather chair, placed a stack of files on the bench, and stood there for a moment, surveying the room. Vance blinked. There was something familiar about the way she held her head, something familiar about the set of her jaw. She looked down at the defense table. "Be seated," she said. The voice. Vance's stomach dropped. It felt like he had swallowed a stone. He knew that voice. He had heard it in the hallway. "You have made a grave error in judgment, Sergeant." He squinted. The judge was not wearing the reading glasses now, and she was wearing the robe, which hid her clothes. But as she sat down, she reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. She slid them onto her nose. Then she looked directly at Vance Harlan. It was her, the woman from the hallway. Vance felt the blood drain from his face so fast it made him dizzy. He grabbed his lawyer's arm. "Lang!" Vance hissed, his voice trembling. "Lang, we have a problem." "Quiet," Lang whispered. "She is reading the docket. The Honorable Judge Naomi Fletcher presiding," the bailiff announced. Lang froze. He whipped his head around to look at Vance. "Fletcher? Did he say Fletcher? Who is she?" Vance whispered, sweat breaking out on his forehead. "She is not a local judge," Lang hissed, panic entering his eyes. "She is from the Federal Circuit. The Department of Justice sends her in when they think the local judges are compromised. They call her the Guillotine. Vance, why is she looking at you like that?" Judge Fletcher arranged her papers. She did not bang the gavel. She did not need to. The silence in the room was absolute. "Before we begin the matter of the United States versus Harlan and others," Judge Fletcher said, her voice amplified by the microphone, calm and deadly, "I have a preliminary housekeeping matter to address regarding the conduct of the defendant." She reached under the bench. Vance stopped breathing. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Fletcher pulled up a bundle of fabric. It was a denim jacket. The left sleeve was torn almost completely off, hanging by jagged threads. She laid the torn jacket on the bench right next to her gavel. It looked like a corpse on an autopsy table. "Mr. Lang." Judge Fletcher said, her eyes never leaving Vance's face. Lang stood up, his legs shaking. Yes, Your Honor. Your client, she said, gesturing to the jacket, seems to have a difficulty with impulse control. In the hallway of this courthouse, he assaulted a woman who he believed was blocking his path. He tore this jacket from her body. He called her a welfare queen. He told her to get out of his face. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The reporters in the front row began furiously typing on their laptops. That woman, Judge Fletcher continued, her voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet, was me. The silence in the courtroom was so profound you could hear the hum of the electric lights. Vance Harlan wanted to vanish. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He looked at the exit signs, calculating the distance, realizing he would never make it. Your Honor, Lang stammered. My client, surely there is a misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding, Counselor. Judge Fletcher cut him off. I was carrying the unredacted files for this case, files I requested personally because I had reason to believe evidence was being tampered with by the local precinct. When your client assaulted me, he knocked those files to the floor. I believe he referred to them as trash. She picked up a file from her desk. This trash contains the internal communications logs between Sergeant Harlan and the district attorney's office. Vance's heart hammered against his ribs, the logs, the text messages where he bragged about planning the drug money. He thought those had been deleted. Now, Judge Fletcher leaned forward. Typically, a judge would recuse herself in a situation where she has become a victim of the defendant. It creates a conflict of interest. Lang let out a breath of relief. Yes, Your Honor, we move for immediate recusal and a mistrial. Clearly, you cannot be impartial. Judge Fletcher smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a trapped rabbit. I anticipated that motion, Mr. Lang. However, under federal rules of criminal procedure and given the special mandate granted to me by the Supreme Court for this specific corruption inquiry, I am not merely presiding as a judge. I am presiding as a special master of inquiry. She opened the file. Furthermore, the assault in the hallway was captured on the courthouse security cameras as well as the body camera of the bailiff who was escorting me. A bailiff Sergeant Harlan failed to notice because he was too busy admiring his own reflection. She pointed to a screen mounted on the wall. Play it! The giant LCD screen flickered to life. The grainy but clear footage showed the hallway. It showed Vance strutting. It showed him collide with her. It showed the shove, the rip, the sneer. The audio was crisp. I do not take orders from welfare queens. The courtroom erupted. People were booing. The mother of the victim in the back row screamed, "That is him. That is what he is." Judge Fletcher banged her gavel once. A sharp crack that silenced the room. Motion for recusal denied. She ruled. This incident speaks directly to the defendant's character, his volatility, and his sense of impunity, all of which are central to the charges of police brutality and corruption facing this court. The jacket stays on the bench as Exhibit A. She looked at Vance. He was slumped in his chair, sweating through his expensive suit. Now, Sergeant Harlan, she said, please stand up. Vance could not move. His legs felt like lead. Stand up, she commanded, her voice like a whip crack. Vance scrambled to his feet, trembling. You told me to see how far I get if I sued you, she said softly. We are not going to sue you, Sergeant. We are going to try you. And since you seem to enjoy tearing things apart, let us see what happens when we tear apart your alibi. She turned to the prosecutor, a young, sharp-looking woman named Elena Grant, who looked like she had just won the lottery. Miss Grant, the judge said, call your first witness, and I believe you have some new evidence regarding the corrupted dashcam footage. Elena Grant stood up, smiling. Yes, Your Honor. It turns out the footage was not corrupted. It was just hidden. And thanks to the files you recovered from the trash in the hallway, we found the encryption key. Vance looked at his partner, Tate. Tate was not looking at him. Tate was looking at the floor, inching his chair away from Vance. The ship was sinking, and the rats were already swimming. Wait, Vance whispered to Lang. Do something. Lang began packing his briefcase. I cannot do anything, Vance. You assaulted a federal judge on tape before the trial even started. You are radioactive. I am not losing my license for you. You cannot leave me. I am not leaving, Lang whispered back, cold and professional, but I advise you to look at the prosecutor's table. Look who just walked in. Vance looked. Walking through the gate was Officer Caleb Reynolds, the rookie from Vance's unit. The kid Vance had bullied into silence for years, the kid who knew where the bodies were buried. Reynolds sat down next to the prosecutor. He looked scared, but he looked determined. Judge Fletcher saw the look on Vance's face. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" she asked. "You look like you have seen a ghost." Vance swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor." "Good," she said, picking up a pen, "because by the time we are done today, you are going to wish you were one." The air in the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer a trial. It was a dissection. Officer Caleb Reynolds, a young rookie with a face that looked like he had not slept in a week, sat in the witness box. His hands were shaking so badly that the plastic water cup in front of him rippled. "State your name and rank for the record," Prosecutor Grant said. "Officer Caleb Reynolds, badge number 4922. Vance leaned forward at the defense table. He did not say a word. He just stared. He locked eyes with the kid, channeling every ounce of menace he had cultivated over his years on the force. It was the look that made drug dealers swallow their tongues, the look that said, "You rat and you die." Reynolds flinched, looking down at his lap. "Officer Reynolds." Judge Fletcher's voice cut through the air. She was not looking at the witness. She was looking at Vance. "Is something distracting you?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor." "Good," she said, her eyes narrowing behind those thick-rimmed glasses. "Because if the defendant continues to attempt to intimidate a federal witness via facial expressions, I will have him shackled and blindfolded for the remainder of these proceedings. Do I make myself clear, Mr. Lang?" Vance's lawyer, Attorney Philip Lang, looked like he was trying to become invisible. "Crystal clear, Your Honor." "Mr. Harlan, look at the wall." Vance ground his teeth, turning his head away, the veins in his neck bulging. "Officer Reynolds," Grant continued, "let us talk about the night of the raid on the warehouse in the warehouse district. What happened?" Reynolds took a deep breath. "We breached the door." Sergeant Harlan led the team. There were 3 suspects inside. They surrendered immediately, hands on heads, knees on the ground. And then Sergeant Harlan ordered me to turn off my body camera. The jury murmured, "Did you?" "Yes," Reynolds whispered. "I was scared. He told me that rookies who do not listen get left behind in bad neighborhoods." And after the cameras were off, Reynolds started to cry, silent tears running down his face. He went to the back room. There was a safe. He cracked it. There was cash inside, a lot of it, bundles of hundreds. He put half in his vest. He gave a bundle to Officer Tate. And then Reynolds paused, his voice trembling. Then he took a drop gun out of his ankle holster, a snub-nosed .38 with the serial numbers filed off. He walked over to one of the suspects, a kid named Jalen Wright. He was young. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped. He put the gun in Jalen's hand. Reynolds sobbed. He pressed his fingers against it to get prints. And then he kicked Jalen in the face and told him, "Congratulations, kid. You just bought a felony possession charge." Objection. Lang stood up half-heartedly. "Hearsay." "Overruled," Judge Fletcher said instantly. "Proceed, Officer Reynolds," the prosecutor said, walking over to the evidence table. "Is this the gun?" She held up a plastic bag containing a rusted revolver. "Yes." "And tell us," she said, turning to look at Vance. "Why are you coming forward now?" Reynolds looked up. He looked at Vance, who was staring at the wall, his jaw clenched. Then he looked at Judge Fletcher, sitting high on the bench, the torn denim jacket resting next to her like a flag of war. Because Reynolds said, his voice gaining strength, "In the locker room, I heard Sergeant Harlan talking on the phone. He was laughing about how he was going to get away with it. He said the system was rigged for people like him. He said judges were just politicians in robes." Reynolds pointed a shaking finger at Vance. "And then I saw what he did in the hallway. I saw him attack her honor, and I realized that if he is willing to do that to a federal judge in broad daylight, he is going to kill me if I do not speak up. He is a monster." Vance slammed his fist on the table. "You lying little punk. Sit down." Judge Fletcher's voice boomed. It was not a request. It was a thunderclap. "Mr. Harlan," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "you have already assaulted the court physically today. Do not assault it verbally. One more outburst, and your bail is revoked immediately." Vance slumped back, fuming, but the damage was done. The blue wall of silence had not just cracked, it had shattered. By the time the defense was in shambles, Lang, the lawyer, looked like he was reconsidering his career choices. He leaned in to Vance. "Vance, listen to me," Lang whispered. "We need to plead right now. I can maybe get you a deal if you allocute. If we go to verdict, she is going to bury you under the prison." Vance looked at the jury. They looked disgusted. He looked at the judge. She looked impassive. But Vance Harlan was a narcissist. He did not see reality. He saw a challenge. He truly believed he could talk his way out of this. He had charmed internal affairs before. He had charmed juries before. He was the hammer. "No," Vance said. "Put me on the stand." Lang's eyes widened. "Are you insane? That woman is a shark. She will eat you alive." "I can handle her," Vance said, adjusting his tie. "She is just an angry woman with a grudge. I will make the jury see that she is biased. I will play the hard job, bad streets card. They love that." Vance do not stand. Vance Harlan sat in the witness box. He sat tall, chest out, giving the jury his best weary protector of the city look. For a while, under his own lawyer's questioning, he did well. He talked about the dangers of the job, the split-second decisions, the stress. He almost looked sympathetic. Then, Prosecutor Grant stood up to cross-examine. But before she could speak, Judge Fletcher raised a hand. "Miss Grant," the judge said, "I will be conducting the inquiry from this point forward." The room gasped. This was highly irregular, but as a special master of inquiry, fully within her rights. Judge Fletcher stood up. She did not stay behind the bench. She walked down the steps, her black robes billowing. She walked until she was standing right in front of the witness box, eye to eye with Vance Harlan. She was not holding a notepad. She was holding the torn denim sleeve. "Sergeant Harlan," she began, her voice conversational, almost polite. "You testified just now that you are a man of extreme discipline. Is that correct?" Vance smiled, a charming, practiced smile. "Yes, Your Honor, you have to be in my line of work. And you testified that you only use force when you feel an imminent threat to your safety or the safety of others." "Correct. Absolutely. Officer safety is paramount." Judge Fletcher held up the sleeve. "In the hallway, when you tore this jacket from my body, did you feel threatened?" Vance hesitated. The trap was obvious, but he had to answer. "I felt obstructed, Your Honor. It was a tense day." "Obstructed?" she repeated. "I am much shorter than you. I was holding papers. You were holding a latte. Did I have a weapon?" "No." "Did I verbally threaten you?" "You were rude." "Rude," Judge Fletcher said, stepping closer. "So, in your world, Sergeant, rudeness is a capital offense, punishable by physical assault." "I did not assault you," Vance blustered. "I moved you with enough force to rip industrial-grade denim," she countered. "Let us talk about Jalen Wright, the young man you framed. Officer Reynolds said you kicked him in the face while he was handcuffed. Did Jalen Wright threaten you?" "Reynolds is a liar," Vance spat. "The kid was resisting." "Resisting." Judge Fletcher turned to the screen. "Exhibit C, the medical report." An image appeared on the screen. A young man's face, swollen, purple, unrecognizable. Jalen Wright had a fractured orbital socket and a broken jaw, Judge Fletcher read. The medical examiner stated the force required to cause this injury is equivalent to being hit with a baseball bat or a steel-toed boot. She turned back to Vance. "You wear steel-toed boots, do not you, Sergeant?" Vance shifted his feet under the stand. "Standard issue. You like to dominate, do not you, Mr. Harlan?" She was relentless now, her voice rising. "You like to make people feel small. You like to remind them that you have the badge and they have nothing. I protect this city," Vance yelled, his composure slipping. "You people sit in your ivory towers judging us. You do not know what it is like out there. The animals I deal with." "Animals?" Judge Fletcher interrupted, her voice ice cold. "Is that what I was in the hallway? An animal blocking your path? You were in my way." Vance roared, standing up in the witness box, forgetting where he was. "You were just some nobody standing in my way. I am the law. I do not move for people. People move for me." Silence. Absolute ringing silence. Vance froze. He realized what he had just screamed. He realized he was standing up, leaning over the railing, rolling, his face twisted in rage. He looked at the jury. They were recoiling, looking at him with pure fear. He looked at his lawyer. Lang had his face buried in his hands. Judge Fletcher did not flinch. She stood her ground, looking up at him with an expression of utter calm. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said softly. "You have just proved the prosecution's entire case. You may sit down." Vance slumped into his chair, defeated. The energy had left him. He knew it was over, but Judge Fletcher was not done. "The jury will disregard the defendant's outburst," she said, returning to the bench. "However, before we proceed to closing arguments, there is one final piece of evidence from the files the defendant so kindly helped me sort in the hallway. She opened a red folder. While reviewing the decrypted phone logs obtained from Sergeant Harlan's device, we found a recurring contact, a number listed only as the architect. Vance's head snapped up. His eyes went wide with genuine terror. For the first time, he was not scared of jail. He was scared of them. "No," Vance whispered. "Do not read that." The texts detail payments not just from drug busts, but payments to a specific offshore account. Payments made to ensure that certain investigations into the city council's zoning reallocations were diverted. The courtroom murmured. This was not just police brutality anymore. This was political corruption. "Sergeant Harlan," Judge Fletcher looked down. "It appears you are not just a bully. You are a bagman. You were planting drugs on residents of low-income housing blocks to get them evicted. Were you not? So the developers could buy the land cheap." "I plead the fifth," Vance screamed. "I plead the fifth." "You already waived your Fifth Amendment rights when you took the stand," Judge Fletcher said ruthlessly. "Sit down." She turned to the bailiff. "Secure the doors. No one leaves." Then she looked at the back of the courtroom. "All right." Sitting in the last row, trying to look inconspicuous, was a man in a gray suit. He had been there all day. "Marshal." The judge pointed a long, black-sleeved finger at the man. "Arrest that man." The man jumped up to run, but 3 bailiffs were on him in seconds. They tackled him to the ground. "Who is that?" someone shouted. "That," Judge Fletcher said, "is Councilman Victor Klein, the man Sergeant Harlan refers to as the architect in his text. The man who ordered the hit on Jalen Wright because the boy's family refused to sell their grocery store." The twist hit the room like a bomb. Vance Harlan was not the mastermind. He was the muscle. He had destroyed lives, framed kids, and terrorized a neighborhood, all to help a politician build a shopping mall. Vance looked at Klein being cuffed. He looked at the judge. He realized the scope of her investigation. "Oh, hey." She had not just come for him. She had used him as the bait to catch the whale. She had let him act arrogant. She had let him think he was in control. She had even let him tear her jacket, all to get him into this room with those files to expose the whole rot. The jury deliberation was short. In the world of high-stakes federal criminal trials, it was a terrifyingly brief amount of time. It meant there was no debate. It meant there was no holdout juror arguing for leniency. It meant the evidence was so overwhelming, so grotesque, that the jurors had looked at each other and agreed immediately. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had transformed from a legal proceeding into a funeral wake. The air was thick, heavy, and silent. Sergeant Vance Harlan sat at the defense table, but he was no longer the hammer. The adrenaline of his earlier outburst had drained away, leaving behind a cold, shaking dread. He stared at the mahogany table, tracing the grain of the wood with a trembling finger. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about how to spin the story. He was not thinking about which favor to call in. He was thinking about the walls of a cell. His lawyer, attorney Philip Lang, was packing his briefcase. It was a subtle motion, but Vance caught it. Lang was organizing his pens, closing his files, checking his watch. He was already checking out. He knew the ship had sunk. He was just waiting for the official time of death so he could leave. "They are coming back too fast." "Are they not?" Vance whispered, his voice cracking. He sounded like a child, asking if the monsters were real. Lang did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the courtroom door. In federal court, fast is bad, Vance. Fast is a landslide. If they had questions, they would have sent a note. There are no notes. Vance felt the bile rise in his throat. He looked back at the gallery. The seats were full, but the faces had changed. The supporters, the other cops from the precinct who had filled the front rows earlier, were gone. They had vanished the moment the text messages about the architect were read. The blue wall had not only crumbled, it had evaporated. In their place remained the people Vance had spent a career tormenting. The mothers of sons he had locked up, the shopkeepers he had shaken down, and right in the center, staring at him with eyes that burned like coals, was Mrs. Wright, the mother of the boy whose face Vance had smashed into the concrete. "All rise." The bailiff's voice was sharper this time, less ceremonial, more final. The door to the jury room opened. The jurors filed out. They walked with a solemn, heavy gait. Not a single one of them looked at the defense table. They looked at the floor. They looked at the judge. They looked at the flag, but they refused to look at Vance Harlan. Judge Fletcher sat high on the bench. She had not moved during the recess. The torn denim jacket was still there, sitting next to her gavel like a silent witness. She watched the jury take their seats, her face a mask of steel. "Mr. Foreman," Judge Fletcher said. Her voice was calm, contrasting with the hurricane of tension in the room. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a retired mechanic with calloused hands and a stern face, stood up. He held the verdict sheet with both hands to keep it from shaking. We have, Your Honor. Publish the verdict. Vance Harlan stopped breathing. The world narrowed down to the foreman's mouth. In the matter of the United States versus Vance Harlan, the foreman began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. On count 1, racketeering and corruption under the RICO Act, we find the defendant guilty. Vance flinched as if he had been slapped. A gasp rippled through the gallery, but it was not shock. It was relief. On count 2, obstruction of justice, guilty. On count 3, perjury, guilty. On count 4, deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. The guilties kept coming like hammer blows, like nails in a coffin. Count 5, count 6, count 7, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, aggravated assault. And on the final count, the foreman paused, looking up for the first time, looking directly at the weeping mother in the third row. Conspiracy to commit murder regarding the attack on Jalen Wright. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. It was not a cheer. It was a release of years of pent-up agony. Mrs. Wright sobbed openly, collapsing into the arms of her daughter. The sound was raw, a mixture of grief and vindication that cut through the sterile air of the court. Judge Fletcher banged her gavel. "Order," she commanded. "There will be order in this court." She waited until the silence returned. Then she turned her gaze to the defense table. "Mr. Lang," she said, "do you wish to poll the jury?" Lang stood up slowly. He looked at Vance, then back at the judge. "No, Your Honor. The defense waives polling." Vance grabbed Lang's sleeve. "What are you doing?" "Fight for me. Do something." Lang pulled his arm away, disgusted. "It is unanimous on all counts." "Vance, it is over. Sit down." Judge Fletcher adjusted her glasses. "The court accepts the verdict. Judgment of conviction is entered. Now, typically, I would set a date for sentencing to allow for pre-sentencing reports." She paused, her eyes locking onto Vance's terrified face. However, given the nature of the crimes, the overwhelming evidence, and the defendant's own conduct in this very building today, I find that a pre-sentencing report is unnecessary. I have heard the testimony, I have seen the evidence, and I have personally experienced the defendant's character. She opened the file in front of her. "We will proceed to sentencing immediately." Vance's heart hammered against his ribs. "Now, right now." "Miss Grant," the judge said to the prosecutor, "the government may speak." Elena Grant stood up. She did not need notes. She walked to the center of the room. "Your Honor, Vance Harlan wore a badge for years. For years, he was supposed to be the line between order and chaos. Instead, he was the chaos. He did not just break the law, he sold it. He sold the safety of this community for cash and ego. He destroyed Jalen Wright's face and his future. He destroyed the trust this city places in its officers. The government asked for the maximum sentence." "Thank you," Judge Fletcher said. She looked past the lawyers. "Mrs. Wright, I see you in the gallery. Under the Crime Victims' Rights Act, you have the right to be heard before I pass sentence. Do you wish to speak?" Mrs. Wright stood up. She was a small woman, trembling with emotion, but she walked to the podium with a dignity that silenced the room. She gripped the wood, her knuckles white. She did not look at the judge. She turned her body and looked directly at Vance Harlan. "You laughed," she said, her voice shaking. "My son told me that when you broke his jaw, you laughed." Vance looked down at the table, unable to meet her eyes. "Look at me!" she screamed, a sound so full of pain that the bailiffs took a step forward. Vance slowly lifted his head. He saw the tears streaming down her face. "My boy wanted to be an architect," she whispered. "Now he can barely speak. He has nightmares where he screams but no sound comes out. You took his voice, you took his smile. And for what? For a bonus. For a pat on the back from a crooked politician." She wiped her eyes. "You called yourself the Hammer. You thought you could crush us because we were poor, because we were black, because we did not have power. But look around you, Mr. Harlan. Look at where you are. You are in a cage now, and my son is free." She turned to the judge. "Lock him away, Your Honor. Lock him away until he forgets what sunlight looks like." Judge Fletcher nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Wright." Finally, the judge turned to Vance. "Defendant Harlan, you have the right of allocution. That means you can speak before I sentence you. Do you have anything to say?" Vance stood up. His legs felt like jelly. He looked around the room, looking for a friendly face, looking for an exit, looking for a miracle. There was nothing, just the cold stare of the judge and the silent judgment of the room. Vance stammered. I was just doing my job. The streets are war zones. You do not understand. I had to be tough. If I was not tough, people got hurt. You were the one hurting them. Judge Fletcher interrupted, her voice sharp. I made mistakes. Vance tried to pivot, his voice taking on a desperate, pleading tone. I am sorry if anyone got hurt. I am a good cop. I have citations. I have medals. Does not that count for anything? I dedicated my life to this city. Judge Fletcher listened. She waited until he trailed off until his excuses ran dry. Then she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the high bench. Mr. Harlan, she began, her tone conversational, but deadly. Do you see this jacket? She picked up the torn denim fabric again. In the hallway, you encountered a woman. You did not see a judge. You did not see a citizen. You saw an object, something to be moved, something to be discarded. She stood up, holding the jacket up for the entire court to see. You tore this jacket because you believed you were untouchable. You believed that your badge gave you the right to occupy any space you chose, and that everyone else existed only by your permission. That is not the mindset of a good cop, Mr. Harlan. That is the mindset of a tyrant. She dropped the jacket onto the bench. It landed with a soft thud that echoed like a gunshot. You speak of your medals. You speak of your service. But let me tell you what I saw in the evidence today. I saw a predator. I saw a man who preyed on the vulnerable because it was easy. You did not fight crime. You organized it. You did not protect the weak. You sold them to the highest bidder. So, Judge Fletcher picked up a pen. There is a concept in the law called breach of trust. It means that when a person in power commits a crime, it is worse than when a civilian does it. Because when you commit a crime, Mr. Harlan, you murder the very idea of justice. You make people afraid of the ones they should run to for help. She looked him dead in the eye. You wanted to know if I knew who you were. You asked me in the hallway. Do you know my name? She paused for effect. Yes, I know your name. And now I am going to make sure history forgets it. She looked down at the sentencing sheet. Vance Harlan, on the count of racketeering, I sentence you to 20 years. On the count of civil rights violations, I sentence you to 10 years. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder, I sentence you to 30 years. Vance's knees buckled. He grabbed the table to stay upright. 30 years, he gasped. I will die in there. These sentences, Judge Fletcher continued, her voice rising, overpowering his plea, are to run consecutively. That is a total of 60 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, she declared. You will be ineligible for parole. You will serve every single day. No, Vance screamed, the reality shattering his mind. You cannot do this. This is a setup. You are biased. I want a retrial. There will be no retrial, Judge Fletcher said calmly. And there is one last thing. She pointed to his chest, to the gold shield pinned to his suit jacket, the badge he had polished every morning for years. The source of his power, the source of his ego. Bailiff, she commanded, remove the defendant's badge. The two U.S. Marshals stepped forward. They were big men, bigger than Vance. They did not ask nicely. One of them grabbed Vance's arms and twisted them behind his back, forcing him to bend over the defense table. Get off me! Vance shouted, struggling, kicking out. Do not touch me! The second marshal reached out. He grabbed the gold badge. He unlatched the pin. The sound of the pin clicking open was audible in the silence. The marshal pulled the badge off Vance's suit. He held it up. It caught the light of the courtroom chandeliers. Bring it here, Judge Fletcher said. The marshal walked up to the bench and placed the badge down. He placed it right next to the torn denim sleeve, the symbol of his authority and the symbol of his arrogance, side by side. You are no longer Sergeant Harlan, Judge Fletcher said, her voice final. You are inmate number 89402. You have no rank. You have no authority. You are just a man who owes a debt to society that you will spend the rest of your natural life paying. She slammed the gavel down, one final thunderous crack that signaled the end of Vance Harlan's life as he knew it. This court is adjourned. Take him away, the marshal ordered. No, no. Vance was sobbing now, a guttural, ugly sound. The fight had left him, replaced by the terrified realization of his future. Please, Judge, I am sorry. I am sorry about the jacket. I will buy you a new one. Just do not do this. The marshals hauled him up. Up. They slapped steel cuffs on his wrists, the same cuffs he had used on thousands of people. They dragged him toward the side door, the prisoner's exit. As they dragged him past the gallery, Vance looked at the faces. He saw Mrs. Wright. She was not looking at him with hate anymore. She was looking at him with pity. That hurt more than the hate. He was nothing to her now. He was just trash being taken out. He looked back at the bench one last time. Judge Fletcher was standing. She had removed her glasses. She was watching him be dragged away, her expression unreadable. She did not look triumphant. She looked like a surgeon who had just cut out a tumor, exhausted, but satisfied that the patient would survive. As the heavy steel door slammed shut behind Vance, cutting off his screams, a profound silence settled over the courtroom. Judge Fletcher looked down at the bench. She picked up the badge. She looked at it for a moment, then dropped it into a metal evidence bin. Then she picked up her torn jacket. She folded the denim carefully, smoothing out the ripped fabric. She placed it into her briefcase. She looked at the gallery, gave a small, respectful nod to Mrs. Wright, and then turned and walked into her chambers, her black robes flowing behind her. The hammer was gone, but the justice remained. Vance Harlan thought he was untouchable because he had power, but he forgot the most important rule of the jungle. You never know who you are dealing with until it is too late. He judged a book by its cover, and that book turned out to be the penal code that put him away for life. Justice is not always swift, and it is not always pretty. But on that hot morning in the federal courthouse, karma did not just knock on the door, it kicked it down. Never underestimate the quiet person standing in your way. In that sweltering Atlanta federal courthouse hallway, Sergeant Vance Harlan learned the hardest lesson of his life. Power without humility is just arrogance dressed up in a badge. He saw a tired, ordinary black woman holding a stack of papers and treated her like she was nothing, something to shove aside, something disposable. What he did not see was the federal judge who held his entire future in her hands. One rip of denim, one cruel sneer, and the man who thought he was untouchable watched his whole empire of fear and corruption crumble in a single morning. This story hits deep because it reminds us that real justice does not always arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing reading glasses and an old denim jacket. Sometimes the person you dismiss, belittle, or bully turns out to be the one who can rewrite your story forever. Life has a way of humbling the proud when we least expect it. The people we think are small often carry the biggest power, not because they shout the loudest, but because they stand for something bigger than themselves. Arrogance blinds us. Humility opens our eyes. Respect is not weakness. It is wisdom. If Vance Harlan's fall taught us anything, it is this. Treat every person with dignity, because you never truly know who you are dealing with. The universe has a long memory, and karma does not miss appointments. What about you? Have you ever misjudged someone and later realized they held more power or importance than you thought? Or has someone's quiet strength ever surprised you in the best or worst way? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If this message touched you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more powerful stories about justice, redemption, and life lessons that actually matter, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell. Let us keep reminding each other that no one is above the law and no act of kindness or cruelty ever goes unseen. Stay humble out there. I will see you in the next one.